Prologue, the architecture of a nation. Imagine for a moment that the eyes of the world are fixed upon you. You have been summoned to the hallowed halls of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The room is cold, vast, and silent, filled with the dignitaries of the earth, heads of state, monarchs, and the architects of global policy. You stand at the podium, the weight of history resting heavily on your shoulders. You have been tasked with a singular, monumental assignment to deconstruct the labyrinth of challenges facing the African continent and the developing world at large. The world is waiting for your diagnosis, but more importantly, at the conclusion of your treatise, they expect a prescription. You are required to offer just one solution, a silver bullet, to resolve the crisis of a continent that has bled potential for decades. What would you recommend? Would you stand before the superpowers and argue for a geopolitical shift? Would you demand that the former colonial masters finally loosen their economic and psychological grip, arguing that the continent cannot breathe until the knee of imperialism is lifted from its neck? Would you argue that freedom is the missing ingredient? Perhaps your recommendation would lean towards humanitarian economics. Would you look the leaders of the G7 in the eye and suggest that the solution lies in philanthropy? Would you recommend that wealthy nations and global NGOs flood the continent with increased aid to tackle the hydra-headed monsters of unemployment, poverty, and the alarming statistic of out-of-school children? Would you argue that if we simply empowered more women and funded more youth development programs, the sleeping giant of Africa would awake? Or, perhaps, your solution would be militaristic. Looking at the carnage in the Sahel and the insecurity plaguing the sub-region, would you appeal to the military superpowers, the United States, Russia, China, Germany, to deploy advanced weaponry? Would you argue that what Africa needs is more lethal force to combat the insurgents and bandits holding our nations by the jugular? In my considered view, none of these interventions will yield a permanent cure. To focus on aid, insurgency, or colonial legacy is to treat the symptoms while ignoring the pathology. These are the manifestations of the illness, not the root cause. If you give a sick man a new coat, he looks better, but he is dying just the same. We must summon the courage to ask the uncomfortable question: what exactly is the root cause of Africa's stagnation? The roommate debate, a clash of ideologies. I recall a spirited debate I had some years ago with a roommate during my university days. We sat in our small room, dissecting the Nigerian dilemma with the passion that only young students possess. Our goal was to proffer a lasting solution to the systemic failure of our nation. My roommate championed a bottom-up philosophy. He was an idealist. He argued that the problem was the people, not the leaders. He believed that if we could devote our energy to raising a generation of good, patriotic, and disciplined followers, we would eventually, perhaps in 20 years, produce the right people to occupy the halls of power and fix the system. His logic was that a clean factory produces clean products. While I respected the sincerity and the logic of his argument, I fundamentally disagreed. My disagreement stemmed from what I perceived as a fatal omission in his hypothesis. It is a sociological impossibility to raise a generation of patriotic, law-abiding followers within a system governed by lawless, unpatriotic leaders. It is a denial of the laws of nature. Water flows from the top down, not the bottom up. To think that the tail can wag the dog is a complete misconception of the concept of leadership itself. The culture of a nation is set by the king, not the peasant, the essence of influence. We must return to first principles. What is leadership? John C. Maxwell, the preeminent leadership scholar, distills the concept into a single word: influence. The Oxford Dictionary expands this, defining influence as the capacity to affect the character, development, or behavior of someone or something. Influence is not merely position, it is power. It is the power to shape thoughts, mold behaviors, and direct actions without the need for physical coercion. In the architecture of any society, influence is the bedrock of trust and the catalyst for change. There is a symbiotic relationship between the leader and the led. The influence exerted by leadership inevitably determines the behavioral patterns of the citizenry. The character of a nation's followers is simply a mirror reflecting the character of its leaders. The follower is the echo. The leader is the voice. If you see a nation of corrupt followers, do not blame the water, blame the source. It is because corrupt leaders are sitting at the helm of affairs. Conversely, if you see a nation of patriotic, self-sacrificing citizens, it is invariably because the hands steering the ship of state are patriotic. Leadership is the central nervous system of a nation. It determines whether the body politic lives or dies. The anatomy of the developing world. To understand this crisis, we must analyze the environment in which we find ourselves. Developing nations are often clinically defined by specific markers: low levels of income and productivity, and stunted human capital development. We see grotesque levels of inequality where a vast rural population lives in abject poverty while a tiny elite lives in opulence. These nations suffer from a lack of industrialization, a dangerous overdependence on subsistence agriculture, and an addiction to foreign aid and external borrowing. As scholars Acemoglu and Robinson have noted, these nations are plagued by weak, fragmented, and dysfunctional institutions, leaving millions disconnected from the modern world of information and opportunity. Tragically, there is a school of thought that blames the victim. They argue that the followers, deprived of quality education, healthcare, and basic human dignity, are responsible for the misery into which the continent has plunged. Others cling to the historical crutch, blaming the colonial masters of the last century, while absolving the current crop of indigenous leaders who loot the Commonwealth with reckless abandon both in arrears and in advance. This is a farce, a joke taken too far. If developing nations ever hope to bridge the gap with the First World, we must surgically address the leadership vacuum. Leadership is the cornerstone of civilization. The decisions made by the few in power shape the trajectory of the many, determining the quality of governance and the prosperity of the society. The tragedy of the Third World is not a lack of resources. It is a lack of ethics, effectiveness, and vision. We are trapped in a cycle of poverty, instability, and social injustice because of a multi-decade legacy of corruption and political gridlock. Leadership failure is the primary architect of our misfortune. As the literary giant Chinua Achebe famously posited, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. It creates misery and retards progress. When leadership collapses, the state ceases to function. The result is a broken market, a collapsed health system, insecurity, and inequality. Look across the African borders. This is the common denominator. Why? African leaders, like many in the developing world, govern with a philosophy of self-interest, prioritizing personal aggrandizement over public welfare. Despite our vast mineral wealth and a vibrant, youthful population, we suffer self-inflicted wounds. The verdict is damning. The continent is governed by incompetent, ineffective, and morally deficient leaders who lack a spiritual compass. The Nigerian case study. Take a hard look at the political landscape of Nigeria. You are forced to question the quality of the souls deciding the nation's destiny. Politics has been weaponized, marred by theft and mismanagement, leaving the citizenry disillusioned and cynical. It is intellectually lazy and morally unfair to expect the followers to fix a broken system while their leaders live in opulence, feeding their lusts with stolen funds. Dreaming of a developed Africa without fixing the leadership crisis is a nightmare, not a vision. Waiting for the West to save us is a delusion. Expecting the broken followership to heal the nation while the head is sick is madness. The institutional imperative. The secret of the developed world lies in the institutions it has built over centuries. But here is the critical insight. Leadership and institutions are self-reinforcing. In the West, strong leaders built strong institutions, and those institutions now build strong people who become future leaders. Consider the titans of modern industry: Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Steve Jobs, and Mark Zuckerberg. Their success is not solely a product of their genius, but of the American educational and economic institutions that nurtured them. These institutions provided the environment for their natural talents to explode. I am convinced, with a heavy heart, that if these same men had been born and raised in the stifling environment of current-day Africa, they would not have achieved half of their potential. We must ask ourselves, how many Bill Gates or Steve Jobs are currently languishing in African villages, their potential rotting away because the environment kills their dreams? How many geniuses have we buried in unmarked graves? Acemoglu and Robinson argue that institutions forge the success or failure of nations. I agree, but I take it a step further. Who builds the institutions? Leaders. Who destroys or stiffens institutions in Africa? Leaders. Therefore, the conclusion is inescapable. No nation can rise above the level of its leadership. The words of hope. Yet, despite this bankruptcy of leadership in Africa and the Third World, I refuse to surrender to despair. I believe there is hope. It is the hope that we can start from where we are and frog jump towards where we ought to be. History is on our side. The United States and the United Kingdom were not born as paradises. They had their dark ages. They had their civil wars and their times of trouble. They went through centuries of refining before transforming their leadership and institutions into the enviable positions we admire today. Our situation is not the worst, provided we are willing to learn from our mistakes and the mistakes of others. This book is not just another manual on leadership development. We are not here to recycle the corporate jargon of the West. My interest is to unveil a higher concept, God's species of leadership. You may ask, why another book on leadership? While this book borrows ideas from general leadership theory, its purpose is distinct. I intend to view the concept through the lenses of God, incorporating His divine architecture into the business of nation building. I am unapologetically a Christian. I believe in biblical principles as the bedrock for shaping the destiny of nations. History has shown that every successful nation, directly or indirectly, derives its success secrets from principles rooted in the Judeo-Christian understanding of leadership. The founding fathers of the United States were inspired by biblical principles of justice, freedom, and servant leadership. These values helped them shape a nation that, despite its struggles, emerged as a beacon of democracy. Similarly, the United Kingdom has been guided by principles of justice and compassion that have transcended political ideologies. In both cases, good leadership grounded in faith and integrity was the driver of economic growth and welfare. I am convinced that if a nation integrates Bible principles into its state of affairs, it is only a matter of time before unprecedented transformation begins. Africa does not need more Western aid to survive. We need God. We need His wisdom to guide our steps in decision-making and policy formulation. At the heart of this transformation is the example set by Jesus Christ. His leadership style provides a blueprint that transcends time and culture. He led with compassion, humility, and purpose. He understood that true leadership is not about wielding power or dominating others, but about serving and empowering those you lead. In a time when leaders exercised power with brutality, Jesus was a revolutionary. He turned the pyramid upside down. He taught that the greatest among us must be a servant, a principle that contrasts sharply with the world today. If we are interested in learning leadership God's way, we must set our gaze on Jesus. This book is a call to action for leaders and aspiring leaders in developing nations to rise above the deficiencies that have plagued our societies. The solutions to our challenges lie not in politics alone, but in the character of the leaders themselves. True leadership begins within, developing a heart that desires to serve, not to be served. It requires a commitment to integrity, where truth is valued over political gain. In the coming chapters, we will explore how Christ's leadership style can serve as the foundation for addressing the African crisis. It is time for a new breed of leaders to emerge. Leaders who are effective, ethical, visionary, and grounded in faith.